ground crews lift the second stage of a Delta II rocket into the mobile gantry at Space Launch Complex 2 West at Vandenberg Air Force Base. The second stage was stacked atop the Delta II rocket, June 21. Credit, NASA, Randy Beaudoin. With each day, another milestone passes like clockwork for engineers and technicians preparing the United Launch Alliance Delta II rocket for liftoff next month from California's Central Coast. With 154 missions in the books, that's a lot for a space launcher. You might be right to say getting a rocket ready to fly is just another day at the office for the Delta II team. But this summer's launch campaign at Vandenberg Air Force Base, overlooking the Pacific Ocean between Los Angeles and San Francisco, is the last for the Delta II program after a run of launches spanning more than 29.5 years. The payload for the last Delta II flight is NASA's ICESat-2 satellite, an orbiting platform that will use a laser to chart the melting of ice brought on by climate change. In a lot of ways, the Delta II launch of ICESat-2 is truly going to be the end of an era, said Tim Dunn, NASA's launch director for the ICESat-2 mission, in a recent interview. It's a little melancholy, but at the same time what a great history to celebrate. On Wednesday, launch controllers loaded propellant into the Delta II's first stage on its launch pad at Vandenberg during a practice countdown, known as a wet dress rehearsal, that exercised ground teams and provided a checkout of the integrity of the first stage propulsion system. The successful wet dress rehearsal came 3 days after ULA and NASA relocated critical members of the Delta launch team from Cape Canaveral to Vandenberg after Sunday's liftoff of a Delta IV Heavy rocket with the Park Solar Probe from Florida's Space Coast. With the practice countdown accomplished, crews at Space Launch Complex 2 West at Vandenberg will ready the Delta II rocket for attachment of the ICESat-2 spacecraft later this month. ICESat-2, short for Ice, Cloud and Land Elevation Satellite, arrived at the Vandenberg launch base in June from a Northrop Grumman Innovation Systems factory in Gilbert, Arizona. Since then, the satellite has been fueled with its own supply of maneuvering propellant, and technicians have verified ICESat-2 is ready for liftoff. Liftoff is scheduled for a launch window opening at 5:46 a.m. PDT, 8:46 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time, 12:46 GMT, on Sept. 15. On its final flight, the Delta II will be propelled by a kerosene-burning first-stage Aerojet Rocketdyne RS-27A main engine, 4 strap-on solid rocket boosters, and a restartable second-stage AJ-10 118K engine. The target for the September 15 mission, a roughly circular polar orbit around 300 miles, nearly 500 kilometers, above Earth. A technician opens and checks the flight door of ICESat's laser altimeter instrument during pre-launch processing inside an Astrotech clean room at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Credit, USAF 30th Space Wing, Timothy Trenkle. During its planned 3-year mission, ICESat-2 will fire a downward-facing onboard laser with 10,000 pulses per second, then precisely measure the time it takes for the laser signals to bounce off Earth's surface and back to the satellite. The measurements will yield information about the height of ice caps, vegetation, land and water surfaces, and clouds. Scientists will use data from ICESat-2, a replacement for NASA's ICESat satellite which operated from 2003 until 2009, to see where ice is melting and flowing, helping quantify and identify the impacts of warming global temperatures. Once bolted to the adapter cone that will connect it to the Delta II second stage, ICESat-2 will be placed in a transport container for the short road trip from the Astrotech payload processing facility to the SLC-2W launch pad. Cranes will hoist the spacecraft, weighing around 1.5 tons, into the launch pad's mobile gantry. The moving service structure will roll back around the Delta II, allowing workers to install the ISAT-2 spacecraft on the rocket, and encapsulate it inside the launcher's composite nose shroud, capping assembly of the 128-foot-tall, 39-meter vehicle. Then comes a sequence of testing to ensure the satellite is properly connected to the Delta II, fueling of the rocket's second stage with storable Aerozine-50 and nitrogen tetroxide propellants, and multiple readiness reviews to clear the mission for takeoff. Workers at Vandenberg lifted the Delta II's first stage on its launch mount June 8, then added an interstage connector June 12. Ground crews mated 4 solid-fueled strap-on boosters in mid-June, and hoisted the Delta II's second stage into position June 21. ULA's Delta team powered up the Delta II in late June for several weeks avionics and propulsion checkouts, then suspended the launch campaign to focus on the Delta IV Heavy launch from Florida with NASA's Park Solar probe. A member of the Delta II team assists in the placement of a solid rocket booster on the first stage of the Delta II rocket at Vandenberg Air Force Base on June 15. Credit: USAF 30th Space Wing. Mark Mackley. The Park Solar probe launch was delayed several times before it lifted off early Sunday, prompting NASA and ULA to push back ISAT-2's launch by 3 days, giving teams time to transition from the East Coast to the West Coast. The upcoming mission will be the 155th flight of a Delta II rocket since the launcher family debuted with the deployment of a GPS navigation satellite on Valentine's Day 1989. Delta IIs, which often lifted off 2 or 3 times per month in the 1990s and 2000s, have been replaced by a broadening fleet of bigger launchers. ULA moved on to focus on the Atlas V and Delta IV boosters, and SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket now carries up many of the same types of payloads that were once tailored for the Delta II. Many of the commercial and military missions once served by satellites sized to fly on the medium-lift Delta II launcher are now accomplished by smaller spacecraft, taking advantage of the miniaturization trend in technology. At the opposite end of the mass spectrum, many commercial communications satellites outgrew the Delta II's capabilities in the 1990s and 2000s. Delta II rockets launched 48 satellites for the U.S. Air Force's Global Positioning System from 1989 through 2009, a 2-decade span during which the satellite network went from a primarily military capability to an everyday public utility that touches billions of people worldwide. Other Delta IIs dispatched NASA's first 3 Mars rovers, Sojourner, Spirit and Opportunity, toward the Red Planet, along with the Messenger mission, which became the first spacecraft to orbit Mercury, the Dawn mission to the asteroid belt, the Spitzer Space Telescope, the planet-hunting Kepler Observatory, several weather satellites, and dozens of commercial and military communications spacecraft. From Vandenberg, Delta II rockets hauled the bulk of Iridium's first-generation fleet of voice and data relay satellites into low Earth orbit on 12 launches from 1997 through 2002. Those satellites are now being replaced by an upgraded Iridium fleet launching on SpaceX Falcon 9 rockets. The Globalstar satellite network, also designed for mobile communications, was deployed by a series of Delta II rockets launched from Cape Canaveral. Ensuring a graceful end to the Delta II program, the last Delta II launch with an Air Force GPS satellite occurred in 2009, ending the military's support of the program as the service contracted further launches with Atlas Vs and Delta IVs. The Delta II's launch history at Cape Canaveral concluded in September 2011 with the liftoff of a pair of NASA science probes to study the Moon's gravity field. The Delta II is the last rocket flying in the U.S. fleet that traces its design to one of the military's 1950s-era missiles developed at the dawn of the space age. The Delta rocket family was derived from the Thor intermediate-range ballistic missile, and engineers have lengthened the Thor's original 8-foot diameter, 2.4-meter, first stage several times, expanding the Delta's propellant capacity. The Delta rocket line has been on the brink of retirement several times, perhaps most notably in the 1980s, when the U.S. government sought to transition all of its satellite launches to the Space Shuttle. That policy changed in the aftermath of the Challenger accident in 1986, resulting in the creation of the Delta II and the restart of the Delta II production line. Delta II's RS-27A main engine has design roots in engines developed for the Saturn I and I-B rockets of the 1960s. The penultimate Delta II launch last November carried NOAA's JPSS-1 weather satellite into orbit from Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. Credit, ULA. Walter Skriptuna's two no other Delta II rockets were under contract when NOAA's SWAMI NPP weather satellite launched on a Delta II flight in October 2011, leaving the program with an uncertain future. But NASA gave the Delta II rocket another lease on life in 2012, with the purchase of 3 more launches from Vandenberg carrying 2 NASA Earth Science satellites and NOAA's JPSS-1 Polar Orbiting Weather Observatory, which lifted off on the most recent Delta II mission last November. The space agency booked the ICESat-2 launch on a Delta II rocket in 2013, adding a 4th flight to the Delta II program's final chapter. As with any long-lived flight program nearing retirement, NASA and ULA had to meticulously ensure they had enough spare parts to replace components that might be damaged during the final Delta II launch campaigns. Officials looked at spare parts for the launch vehicles themselves, ground support equipment, and concerns that Delta II personnel might want to leave the program because of its impending retirement, Dunn said. "It's been incredibly successful for us in managing spare parts," Dunn said. "There were certain parts where the vendor went out of business, or quit making the parts many years ago. So, while the vendor was still in business, ULA ensured that at least one spare was made for every critical component on the rocket, and then an evaluation of the entire rocket was made. To pick a term out of fairy tales, the golden egg process was put in place," Dunn said. Certain components on the rocket or its one-of-a-kind spare were deemed golden eggs, and handled as such since the 2011 or 2012 timeframe. You would walk through the factory, and you would see certain items with a big golden egg placard on them. Here we are at the end of that process. We are still in very good shape in having at least one spare for all critical components," Dunn said. For the last 6 decades, the builders of the Delta rocket family changed names through multiple corporate mergers and acquisitions, beginning with the Douglas Aircraft Company, then succeeded by McDonnell Douglas, Boeing on United Launch Alliance, formed in 2006 by the marriage of Boeing and Lockheed Martin rocket programs. The more powerful Delta IV rocket built by ULA is a new design, incorporating different hydrogen-fueled engines, and wider propellant tanks than the Delta II. Counting the Delta IV family, the launch of ICESat-2 next month will be the 381st flight of a rocket carrying the Delta name since 1960. NASA launch director shares his Delta II memories. "Delta has such a rich history, starting back in 1960, Dunn told Spaceflight Now. If you talk to real graybeards on the program, it was on death's doorstep probably at least 3, maybe 4 times, when everyone thought for sure that was the last launch ever, and they were all out of jobs, and somehow it kept getting new life. For this version of Delta, we are certain that this one will not fly after ICESat-2, he said. After stints as an Air Force as a GPS satellite analysis officer and a Titan IV launch controller, Dunn joined the Delta II program at Boeing in 1996, supporting dozens of missions as a launch day guidance engineer. One of his first missions on the Delta II rocket was the launch of Mars Pathfinder in December 1996, which delivered NASA's first rover to the Red Planet. "One of our first missions was the Mars Pathfinder mission," Dunn said. "That was the very small rover that we sent to Mars back in the fall of '96. That one was really satisfying to me because it was super cool deep space mission with NASA, our customer at the time. We were sending something to crawl around on the surface of Mars." Hot Wheels produced a toy version of Mars Pathfinder's Sojourner rover before the mission's launch. "My son was just a couple of years old, so it's something I could relate to him with toys," Dunn said. "So Pathfinder sticks out." NASA launch director Tim Dunn, the lower right, oversees the countdown before the final Delta II launch from Cape Canaveral in September 2011. credit, NASA. Kim Shiflett-Dunn joined NASA's Launch Services Program in 2000 as a Delta II avionics and flight controls engineer, then became NASA's Delta II vehicle systems engineer in 2003, leading the agency's technical team ensuring Delta II rockets were ready to loft science probes into the solar system. From a constellation build-up point of view, the global star sequence of launches that we did back in the summer of '99 timeframe, Dunn said. Those were really fun because of the repetition. I want to say we were launching every couple of weeks there, at least for a few of them, fire to fire. Supporting the Air Force through all those years, that's a special memory with GPS, Dunn said. From 1989 when GPS 2-1 first launched, as you progressed through the 90s, that was the time when GPS went from this military system that only the military used to essentially a common everyday person's utility. That was really fun to be supporting and sustaining the constellation that everyone was beginning to use. Fast forward to 2018, and when you talk to younger kids today about GPS, they can't imagine life without GPS, on your phone, on your watch, in your car. Other Delta II launches high on Dunn's favorites list include the back-to-back liftoffs in June and July 2003 with NASA's Spirit and Opportunity Mars rovers. Opportunity, which took off second in 2003's interplanetary launch window, had to use a version of the rocket known as the Delta II Heavy, the first Delta II to fly with uprated, more powerful solid rocket boosters. We launched them both in the summer, so we were able to hit the Mars window with 2 different launches from Complex 17, at Cape Canaveral, Dunn said. One was a standard Delta II-7900 series, and the other with the Heavy. That was a huge development effort, bringing the Heavy online, a real challenge because of the planetary window we had to hit. Dunn's first mission as launch director was the last Delta II flight from Cape Canaveral in 2011. That one was very special, he told Spaceflight Now in an interview. Dunn said his move from the Air Force's Titan IV program, which primarily launched one-of-a-kind, costly U.S. military satellites, to the workhorse Delta II was a major change. The Titan IV team vastly outnumbered the Delta II workforce, despite the Delta II's higher launch rate. I really enjoyed those Titan IV launches, but it was hard to identify with the whole team, and the rocket was kind of a fairly complex rocket, especially with the Centaur second stage, just big and fun, Dunn said. Then I went to the Delta II, and it was a little smaller. You could get your hands around the systems, and you could walk the tower a lot more easily, and the team that you were working with was kind of an order of magnitude smaller, so that made it feel more like family. That's one of the things that I'll miss, Dunn said. That may be replicated on some of the newer providers, especially the smaller providers have smaller teams. Just my knowledge of the hardware systems on Delta II. When you grow up and you invest so many years in a particular rocket, you really feel like you know it inside and out. The Delta II's iconic color will also become a part of space history, with the rocket's retirement. And of course that baby blue paint scheme, Dunn said. I'm going to miss that because I don't see another rocket out there painted in baby blue just yet, but maybe there will be one coming. Email the author. Follow Stephen Clark on Twitter, @StephenClark1.